Hello, friends. We think we know Loki as the charming anti-hero of the silver screen, but the original texts tell a darker, stranger tale. Today's version of the Trickster is a polished, sympathetic figure, yet the people of the Viking Age knew someone far more visceral and dangerous. He was not merely a misunderstood brother. He was an entity of profound instability. To truly see him, we must look into a world defined by survival and sharp iron. This is the Loki who shifted his form into a mare to lure away a giant stallion, eventually giving birth to the eight-legged horse Sleipnir. This is the character who once tied a rope between a goat's beard and his own sensitive anatomy, engaged in a screaming tug-of-war just to settle a lethal dispute. Most chilling of all, he was the cold heart behind the first murder in paradise, tricking a blind god into piercing his own brother's chest with a dart of mistletoe. This version of Loki does not seek redemption. He seeks the end of all things. I'm just a narrator reading the old stories. If you'd like to stay for the next chapter, feel free to subscribe. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Now listen closely as the wind picks up and we step inside the heavy timber walls of an ancient Norse hall. The firelight flickers against the soot-darkened rafters, casting long, jagged shadows that dance like restless spirits. To understand the figure shifting in those shadows, you first have to understand the ground beneath your feet. The Old Norse didn't see the universe as a simple battleground between good and evil, nor did they view their gods as perfect moral anchors. Instead, they perceived a fragile, often violent balance between structure and the wild, unbridled forces of the outside world. Loki sits at the very heart of that friction. He is a walking contradiction, a man of two worlds who belongs fully to neither. His father was Farbauti, a name that translates to the cruel striker or the lightning. His mother was Laufey, often associated with the thin, brittle needles of the pine tree. Ancient wisdom suggests that when the lightning struck the leaves, Loki was born from the resulting fire. He is the literal offspring of a storm, a child of the Jotun. These were the primal beings, often called giants, though they were less about physical size and more about the raw, dangerous power of the natural elements. They were the personification of the biting frost, the crushing mountain, and the sea that swallows ships without a trace. By his blood alone, Loki should have been an eternal enemy of the Ægir, the gods who claimed the high seats of Asgard. Yet here he is, walking the golden halls and sitting at the table of the All-Father. This wasn't an accident of birth or a gesture of pity. It was a bond forged in the heat of shared history. Long before the walls of their great city were even finished, Odin and Loki stood together on the open earth. They cut their skin and let their blood mingle in the soil, swearing a sacred oath that one would never drink unless the other was also offered a cup. By bringing a son of the Jotun into the inner circle, Odin was inviting the wilderness into his home. It was a calculated risk. The Ægir represented order, law, and the preservation of the status quo. Loki, however, represented the flux.
When they mingled their blood, it wasn't just a promise of friendship, it was a metaphysical merging. In the Norse mind, blood carried the soul and the very essence of a being. By mixing his ichor with Loki's, Odin took a piece of the chaos into himself, and Loki took a piece of the divine order. This is why the gods tolerated his presence, even when his pranks turned cruel or his tongue became too sharp. To cast Loki out would be to sever a piece of Odin himself. Odin, the seeker of wisdom, who would sacrifice his own eye for a glimpse of the future, saw something in Loki that the other gods lacked. While Thor relied on his hammer and Tyr on his courage, Loki possessed a mind that worked like a river after a spring thaw, fast, unpredictable, and capable of finding the path of least resistance through any obstacle. In these early days, Loki wasn't the monster that modern stories often portray. He wasn't looking to burn the world down just for the sake of the flame. He was the catalyst. Think of him as the grit in the oyster that eventually produces the pearl. Without Loki, the gods would have grown stagnant, trapped in the boredom of their own perfection. It was Loki who cheated the master builder out of his payment, giving the gods their invincible walls for free. It was Loki who secured the treasures that defined their power, the spear of Odin and the hammer of Thor. He created the problems, yes, but he also provided the solutions that made the gods stronger. He was the engine that kept the story moving forward, even when he was driving it toward the edge of a cliff. He lived in the tension between the hearth and the wildfire, a necessary shadow that gave the light its meaning. That shadow wasn't just a byproduct of the light. It was a functional part of the divine machinery. To understand why the gods tolerated a trickster among their ranks, we have to look at the very foundations of their home. Asgard was grand, surely, but it was also a massive target. The Ægir were powerful, but they were often trapped by their own rigid sense of honor and a surprising lack of foresight. They needed a locksmith for the doors they accidentally locked themselves behind. They needed someone who could navigate the gray areas of a world that they saw in strict blacks and whites. Early in the history of these golden halls, an unnamed builder arrived with a proposal that sounded too good to be true. He promised a wall so high and so thick that no mountain giant could ever hope to breach it. His price, however, was staggering. He wanted the goddess Freya as his wife, along with the very sun and the moon from the sky. The gods hesitated. They craved the security, but they weren't willing to pay the celestial cost. This is where the pattern begins. It's the first recorded instance of the gods looking toward the periphery of their circle, to the man who didn't think like them, the man who saw the world as a series of deals rather than a series of battles. Loki didn't see a threat in the builder's offer. He saw a loophole. He stepped into the center of the council and convinced the gods that if they set an impossible deadline, a single winter, the builder would never finish in time. By his logic, they would get a significant portion of a defensive wall built for free, and they wouldn't have to give up anything. It was a gamble based on a calculated risk, a specialty of his that the others lacked the imagination to conceive. The gods, greedy for a bargain and desperate for a shortcut, agreed to the terms. They patted themselves on the back for their cleverness, failing to realize they were just following Loki's lead. But they had underestimated the horse, Svadalfari. The beast was a terrifying force of nature, hauling stones the size of longhouses through the frozen nights without once tiring. As the final days of winter approached, the wall was nearly finished, glistening and impregnable. The gods faced a catastrophic loss of their own making. They were about to lose the light of the sky and the heart of their family. Their reaction, as it so often was, wasn't to take responsibility for their own greed. It was to turn on the man who had facilitated it. They cornered Loki, threatening him with a slow and painful death if he didn't find a way out of the contract he had engineered. This was the crucible Loki lived in, a constant, exhausting cycle of being the architect of a plan, the scapegoat for its potential failure, and eventually the only one capable of fixing it. Loki didn't use a sword or a hammer to stop the builder. He used a distraction. Transforming himself into a beautiful mare, he lured the stallion Svadilfari away into the deep woods. Without the horse's strength, the builder couldn't finish the final gate before the sun rose on the first day of spring. The contract was broken. The builder, revealed as a giant in disguise, was killed by Thor, and the gods kept their sun, their moon, and their sister. But the cost was carried by Loki alone. He disappeared for months, eventually returning with an 8-legged colt named Sleipnir, a living, breathing reminder of the lengths he had to go to cover for the gods' mistakes. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. It was the standard operating procedure for the halls of the Ægir. The gods would encounter a problem, often one born of their own arrogance, and reach a stalemate. Loki would offer a clever, high-stakes solution that pushed the boundaries of their comfort. When that solution inevitably veered toward disaster, the gods would panic and demand a miracle, and Loki would deliver, usually through some form of self-sacrifice or clever deceit. He became the indispensable fixer, the one who cleaned up the divine messes, ensuring the status quo remained intact while he himself was pushed further into the margins. He was the insurance policy for their pride, the necessary chaos that kept their order from crumbling. Insurance is often paid for in ways the policyholder refuses to acknowledge. And while the gods held the keys to the kingdom, Loki held the match that lit the forge. The transition from a mere nuisance to an essential architect of their power began not with a grand vision of war, but with a pair of shears and a lazy afternoon. Sif, the golden-haired wife of Thor, was known for a beauty that mirrored the ripening wheat of the harvest. Her hair was her pride, a cascading river of light that defined her standing among the Æsir. To Loki, however, that beauty was nothing more than a target. In a moment of impulsive, unadulterated malice, he crept into her chambers while she slept and shorn her bald. He didn't do it for profit or for a higher purpose. He did it to see the light leave her eyes and to watch the order of the household shatter. When Thor discovered the violation, the golden halls shook with a thunder that had no rain. He didn't look for clues or weigh evidence. He went straight for the one throat that always deserved a grip. Loki, dangling inches from the ground as Thor's knuckles tightened, realized that his insurance policy had finally hit its deductible. To save his life, he promised the impossible. He would travel to the lightless depths of the earth and convince the master smiths of the dwarves to craft a replacement. Not just a wig of silk or gold, but living tresses that would take root in Sif's scalp and grow as if they were her own. This journey into the belly of the world was where the prank evolved into a pivotal moment in history. Loki sought out the sons of Ivaldi, craftsmen who viewed the gods with a mixture of professional distance and quiet mockery. Through flattery and the kind of silver-tongued manipulation that only he could master, Loki didn't just walk away with the hair. He goaded them into proving their superiority by creating two other wonders, Gungnir, a spear that would never miss its mark, and Skidbladnir, a ship that could carry all the gods, yet fold small enough to fit inside a pocket. But Loki, never satisfied with a simple victory, saw an opportunity to stir even deeper waters. He approached another pair of brothers, Brokkr and Sindri, and laid down a wager. He bet his own head that they could not produce 3 items that could equal the craftsmanship of the sons of Ivaldi. It was a high-stakes gamble born of pure vanity and the thrill of the chase. As Sindri began to work the bellows, Loki realized he had perhaps underestimated his opponents. Desperate to save his own neck, he transformed into a stinging fly, a tiny agent of chaos in the sweltering heat of the forge. As the brothers worked, Loki struck. He bit Brokkr on the hand, but the dwarf did not flinch, and from the fire emerged Gullinbursti, a boar with bristles of gold that could run through air and water faster than any horse, shedding light into the darkest nights. Loki bit the dwarf on the neck during the second forging, yet Brokkr held firm, and they pulled Draupnir from the flames, a heavy gold ring that would drop 8 identical rings every 9th night, ensuring the wealth of the gods would never dwindle. Finally, the smiths began their greatest work. This was to be the weapon that would define an era. Loki, sensing his doom, became desperate.
He bit Brokkr on the eyelid, biting so deep that blood began to pour, blinding the smith for a single, crucial second. Brokkr reached up to wipe the blood away just as the work was being finished. When the hammer was pulled from the forge, its handle was shorter than intended, a flaw in an otherwise perfect creation. This was Mjolnir. Loki returned to the high halls of the gods, not as a thief or a vandal, but as a bringer of gifts. He presented the treasures with the flair of a showman, distributing the power of the earth to the rulers of the sky. To Odin he gave the spear Gungnir and the ring Draupnir, symbols of a king who would never miss his mark and whose coffers would always be full. To Frey he gave the golden boar and the folding ship, the tools of a god who commanded the elements and the bounty of the earth. And finally, to Thor he gave the golden hair for his wife and the short-handled hammer. The gods sat in judgment. Despite the flaw in the hammer's handle, they declared Mjolnir the greatest gift of all, for it was the only thing that could truly protect them from the giants that lurked at their borders. Loki had intended to cause pain, then he had intended to save his own skin, and finally he had intended to sabotage the very tools he was commissioning. Yet the result was the foundation of Asgard's military and economic hegemony. When the dwarves came to collect Loki's head as payment for the lost wager, he provided one final masterclass in the art of the loophole. He told them they could have his head, as agreed, but the contract gave them no right to touch a single inch of his neck. Frustrated and outmatched by his legalistic cruelty, the dwarves settled for sewing his lips shut with an owl and a leather thong. It was a temporary silence for a god who had just handed his enemies the very weapons they would use to keep him in his place. Looking at the icons of the gods, we see the reflection of Loki's malice. The spear that Odin leans on, the hammer that Thor swings to break the skulls of his enemies, the wealth that flows through the halls, none of it was earned through divine merit. It was all forged in the fires of a prank gone wrong.
Asgard's glory was not a natural state of being. It was an artificial height scaled by standing on the back of a trickster. They wore his efforts like armor, never realizing that by accepting his gifts, they had permanently tethered their fate to his chaos. The power of the gods was, at its heart, a stolen miracle, a collection of treasures born from the spite of a man who just wanted to see what would happen if he cut a woman's hair in the dark. But those early days of playful spite and clever restitution were merely the prelude to a much longer, colder shadow. If the hair of Sif and the hammer of Thor were the artifacts of Loki's youth, his next creations would be his legacy, and eventually the instruments of his revenge. Loki did not find his next inspiration within the golden halls of the gods, but in the Ironwood, a dark and gnarled forest where the sun struggled to penetrate the canopy of twisted trees. There lived Angrboda, a giantess whose name translates to the bringer of sorrow. She was not a goddess of grace or a spirit of the hearth. She was a force of ancient, raw nature. Their union was not one of diplomatic convenience or romantic poetry, but a convergence of chaos and winter. From this union came 3 children who would redefine the boundaries of fear for the residents of the high seat. First was Hel, a daughter who seemed to be a walking contradiction. One half of her body was the vibrant, soft flesh of a living girl, while the other was the blue-black, rotting skin of a corpse. She was the personification of the threshold, the physical manifestation of the boundary between what breathes and what has ceased to be. Then came Jormungandr, a serpent of such impossible vitality that he seemed to grow even as you watched him. His scales were cold, his eyes reflected no light, and his presence felt like a tightening noose around the neck of the world. Finally, there was Fenrir. At first he was just a cub, a wolf with eyes that held an intelligence far too sharp for an animal, a creature whose hunger seemed to swallow the very air around him. The gods were not blind to these developments. Odin, the All-Father, was a man obsessed with the horizon of the future. He sat upon his high throne and looked out across the 9 worlds, and what he saw troubled his spirit. The prophecies, whispered by those who could see through the veils of time, began to coalesce into a singular, terrifying vision. These 3 children of Loki and Angrboda were not merely monsters, they were the architects of the end. They were the teeth, the venom, and the cold grave that would one day claim the gods themselves. Odin acted not out of malice, but out of a desperate, panicked need for order. He seized the children. Hel was cast down into the freezing depths of the world below, where she was given authority over the inglorious dead, those who died of sickness or old age, rather than on the field of battle. She became the queen of a gray land, a mirror to her father's own isolation. Jormungandr was hurled into the vast, churning ocean that circled the earth. The impact was said to have shaken the foundations of the mountains, and as the serpent sank into the dark water, he continued to grow until his body ringed the entire world, his own tail eventually finding its way back into his mouth, a living circle of scales and spite. But Fenrir was different. The gods brought the wolf back to their own home. Perhaps they thought they could domesticate the threat, or perhaps they simply wanted to keep their greatest fear where they could see it. For a time, Fenrir walked among them. He was a pup in the halls of the powerful. Only one among the Ægir, the brave and honorable Tyr, had the courage to approach him, to feed him, and to treat him with something resembling affection. But the wolf grew. He grew with a speed that defied nature. Every day his shadow grew longer across the grass of the celestial meadows, and every night the sound of his low growl seemed to vibrate in the stones of their palaces. The fear in the hearts of the gods turned from a simmer to a boil. They decided that Fenrir could no longer be free. They approached the wolf with a game, masking their terror with the language of sport. They challenged him to test his strength against a chain, claiming they wanted to see if any metal could hold him. Fenrir, proud and eager to show his power, allowed them to bind him. He shattered the first chain, Lædingr, with a simple stretch of his muscles. The gods brought a second, much heavier chain, Droni, and again the wolf exploded through the iron links like they were made of dry straw. Desperate, the gods turned to the dark elves, the mastersmiths who understood the weight of things that cannot be seen. They did not forge a chain of iron or steel. Instead, they crafted Gleipnir. It was as thin and smooth as a silken ribbon, yet it was made from 6 impossible ingredients: the noise of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. It was a chain built of paradoxes, a physical manifestation of the things that do not exist. When the gods brought this ribbon to Fenrir on the island of Lyngvi, the wolf sensed the trap. The air felt different. The gods' smiles were too rigid, their eyes too wide. Fenrir looked at the thin cord and felt the weight of its unnatural origin. He refused to be bound unless one of the gods placed their hand in his mouth as a pledge of good faith, a guarantee that if the ribbon did not break, they would release him. The silence that followed was the sound of a crumbling bridge. The gods looked at one another, their bravery evaporating in the face of the wolf's demand. Only Tyr stepped forward. He knew the cost. He knew the ribbon would not break. He placed his right hand between the wolf's massive, jagged teeth as the gods tightened Gleipnir. Fenrir struggled, his muscles bulging, his claws tearing at the earth. But the ribbon held. The harder he fought, the tighter it gripped. When the wolf realized he had been betrayed, his jaws snapped shut. The screams of the wolf were matched by the silence of Tyr, who stood stoically as his hand was severed from his arm. The gods cheered, celebrating their safety, but the victory was hollow. They had saved their lives by sacrificing their honor. They drove a sword through Fenrir's jaw to keep him from biting, the hilt touching the bottom of his mouth and the point touching the roof, leaving him to howl a river of foam and rage until the end of days. In the shadows, Loki watched. He saw his daughter exiled to the land of the dead. He saw his son cast into the crushing depths of the sea, and he saw his most magnificent child tricked, bound, and tortured by the very people he had once helped. The gods believed they had secured their future, but they had only ensured its destruction. They had taught Loki that the rules of the house were a lie, and that the only thing more powerful than a god's fear is a father's hatred. The seeds of the end were no longer just a prophecy. They were planted deep in the earth, watered by the blood of a friend and the tears of a monster. That slow burning resentment didn't just change Loki's heart. It altered the very nature of his crimes. He was no longer playing for laughs or seeking a clever advantage to prove his worth. He was playing for survival in a world that he realized would discard him the moment he ceased to be useful. This shift reached its breaking point on a barren mountainside, far from the golden halls where the gods drank their fill. It began with a simple, gnawing hunger. Odin, Honir, and Loki were traveling through a desolate wilderness, looking for a meal to sustain them on their journey. They found a herd of oxen and slaughtered one, but as they laid the meat over the embers, a strange thing happened. The fire burned hot, the wood crackled and hissed, but the flesh remained raw and cold. It was as if the laws of physics had turned against them. High above, perched on a branch of a gnarled tree, sat an enormous eagle. This was no mere bird of prey, but the giant Thiassi in disguise, watching the gods with eyes full of ancient malice. He mocked them from his height, claiming he was the one preventing the meat from cooking. To eat, he said, they would have to share their kill with him. Loki, never one to tolerate a slight from a creature he deemed beneath him, lost his temper. He grabbed a heavy staff and swung it at the eagle with all his might. But as the wood struck the bird's feathers, a trap was sprung. The staff stuck fast to the eagle's back, and Loki's hands became fused to the wood. He was tethered to the giant, unable to let go. The eagle took flight, soaring over the jagged peaks and dragging Loki across the sharp rocks and through freezing mountain streams. For the first time in his life, we see Loki truly broken by physical agony. He wasn't the clever schemer in this moment. He was a terrified victim, screaming for mercy as his bones rattled against the stone. Thiassi knew exactly what he wanted for Loki's release. He didn't want gold or power. He wanted Idun and her magical apples. These were the golden fruits that granted the gods their eternal youth, the only thing standing between them and the ravages of time. To save his own skin, Loki did the unthinkable. He promised to deliver the keeper of their immortality into the hands of their enemy. When they returned home, Loki acted with a cold, calculated precision. He found Idun in her garden and spoke to her with a voice like honey. He told her he had found a forest nearby where even more magnificent apples grew, fruits that surpassed her own in beauty and power. He urged her to bring her own apples along so she could compare them. It was a lie built on her own dedication to her craft. Trusting her friend and companion, Idun followed him beyond the safety of the walls. The moment they were in the open, Thiassi descended in his eagle form, clutching the goddess in his talons and whisking her away to his mountain fortress in Jotunheim. The consequences of Loki's cowardice were immediate and horrific. Asgard didn't just lose a citizen, it lost its future. Without Idun's apples, the gods began to wither. This is a side of the Norse pantheon we rarely explore, their fragility. They were not naturally immortal, they were merely well-fed. Within days, the golden hair of the goddesses turned to brittle gray. The mighty muscles of the warriors began to sag and waste away. Odin, the All-Father, found his legendary wisdom clouded by the fog of senility. Their joints ached, their eyes grew dim, and a terrifying silence fell over the halls. They were staring into the face of mortality, feeling the cold breath of the grave for the very first time. In their panic and frailty, the gods gathered what strength they had left to find the culprit. They remembered seeing Loki leave the gates with Idun. They dragged him into the center of their circle, their shaking hands gripping his throat. The mask of the playful trickster was stripped away, leaving only the resentful outcast. They threatened him with every torment imaginable, and under the weight of their collective wrath, Loki cracked. He confessed, but it wasn't out of guilt. It was out of a desperate need to avoid the pain they promised him. He borrowed a falcon's plumage from Freya, shifting his shape to take to the skies. He He flew to the giant's hall while Thiassi was out at sea, finding Idun weeping in her stone prison. Using his magic, he transformed the goddess into a single nut, clutched her in his claws, and began the long flight home. But the giant returned and saw his prize was gone. Taking the form of a massive eagle once more, Thiassi pursued Loki across the sky. The gods watched from the walls, their old, tired eyes straining to see the two specks on the horizon. They prepared a massive pile of wood shavings along the ramparts. As Loki cleared the walls, exhausted and gasping for air, the gods set the wood ablaze. The fire roared upward just as Thiassi crossed the threshold. The giant's feathers caught the flames, and he tumbled from the sky, a screaming ball of fire crashing into the courtyard where the gods finished him off. Idun was returned, and the gods ate of her fruit, feeling the strength return to their limbs and the color to their cheeks. They laughed and celebrated their victory over death. But as they looked at Loki, standing off to the side, scorched and shivering, the laughter died away. They had seen his true face. They knew now that he would sell their very lives to save his own. The youth had returned to their bodies, but the trust was gone forever. Loki had saved them, yes, but he was the one who had put the knife to their throats in the first place. The bridge between the trickster and his family hadn't just been cracked, it had been burnt to ash. The silence that followed the burning of those bridges was not one of peace, but of a vacuum waiting to be filled. When you have severed the ties of blood and duty, the only thing left to rely on is your own cleverness. Loki, now unmoored from the expectations of the Ægir, turned his gaze toward the frozen horizons of the north, toward the high-walled fortresses of the giants. It was a journey born of a strange necessity, a need to prove that even in a world of monsters and scale, his mind remained the sharpest blade in existence. But Jotunheim has a way of distorting the familiar. As Loki and Thor approached the citadel of Utgard, the very air seemed to thicken with a sense of wrongness. The architecture didn't just defy logic, it ignored it. The gates were so massive they had to tilt their heads back until their necks ached just to see the top, yet the bars were wide enough for them to simply walk through. Inside the hall of the giant king, Utgard Loki, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of roasting meat and the low rumble of laughter that sounded like shifting tectonic plates. The king himself sat upon a throne that seemed carved from a mountain. He didn't greet them with hostility, but with a terrifyingly polite condescension. He told them that no one was permitted to stay in his hall unless they were a master of some craft or feat. For Loki, this was the invitation he had waited his whole life to hear. This was his arena. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the heavy air, claiming that no one could eat faster than he. It was a boast rooted in a lifetime of hunger, not just for food, but for recognition and dominance. The king accepted the challenge, summoning a figure named Logi to sit at the opposite end of a long wooden trough filled to the brim with meat. This was the moment where Loki expected to shine. He began to eat with a focused, frantic energy, his hands moving in a blur as he stripped the bones clean and moved down the line. He reached the center of the trough in record time, confident and triumphant. But when he looked up, he saw that Logi had already finished his half. More than that, Logi had not just eaten the meat, he had consumed the bones and the wooden trough itself. For the first time in his long life, Loki was confronted with a total, undeniable defeat in a field where he believed he was supreme. The following morning, as the king escorted them out of the fortress, the tone shifted. The polite mask slipped, and the truth began to bleed through the cold morning mist. Utgard Loki looked at them and confessed that he had used illusions to protect his people from their power. The contest had been a lie. Loki hadn't been competing against a giant, he had been competing against wildfire. Loki was the personification of fire itself, and no matter how fast a man or a god can eat, they can never outpace the hungriest element in nature. This revelation is the crux of Loki's existence. It is a moment of profound philosophical weight. Throughout his history, Loki is the force that disrupts, the variable that changes the equation. He represents chaos, and chaos usually prides itself on being the ultimate disruptor. But here, in the cold light of the giant's country, Loki learned that chaos has a ceiling. There are forces in the universe that are not subject to the whims of the trickster. You can lie to a king, you can trick a god, and you can manipulate a hero, but you cannot deceive the fundamental laws of physics. Fire does not care about your cleverness. It does not care about your ego or your tragic backstory. It simply consumes. This encounter stripped Loki of his most prized possession, the belief that he was the smartest person in any room. He realized that reality is not a static thing to be toyed with, but a collection of forces that can be masked or hidden by someone with even greater skill in deception than his own. He was the master of the small lie, but Utgard Loki was the master of the systemic lie. The giant king had turned the entire landscape into a mirage, proving that perception is a fragile thing, easily shattered by those who understand the mechanics of the mind. Loki left that fortress changed. The humiliation of losing to a natural force stayed with him, a reminder that even the architect of chaos is ultimately a tenant in a universe governed by older, more indifferent powers. It reinforced the idea that while he could fracture the relationships of Asgard, he was still bound by the same reality as everyone else. He was not above the world, he was merely a part of it, and even his most brilliant schemes were subject to the cold, hard truths of the natural order. This realization didn't make him humble. Instead, it made him more dangerous. If the world was built on illusions and hidden forces, he would simply have to learn how to weave a larger net. He understood now that to truly control the board, he couldn't just play the game. He had to become the one who defined the reality of the players. That definition of reality began not with a grand war or a cosmic shift, but with a dinner invitation he was never meant to keep. In the golden hall of the sea giant Ægir, the air was thick with the scent of roasted meat and the self-congratulatory laughter of the powerful. The gods were celebrating themselves, basking in a sanctuary where their history had been scrubbed clean and their crimes rebranded as divine necessity. They had created a world where their flaws were hidden behind golden masks, but Loki stood at the threshold, a ghost at the feast, ready to strip those masks away. The evening began with a spark of petty violence. When the gods praised the servants of the hall for their efficiency and grace, Loki found the sweetness of the compliments unbearable. He struck down the servant Fimafang, not out of a simple bloodlust, but because he could no longer tolerate the sight of the gods projecting their own shadows onto those beneath them. He was driven out into the darkness, but he did not flee. He waited. He gathered his thoughts, sharpening his tongue like a surgeon's blade, and then he walked back through the doors. The silence that met him was cold, but Loki was colder. When they tried to deny him a seat, he reached back into the forgotten foundations of their own order. He reminded Odin of the day they had mixed their blood in a bowl, a pact made in the heat of youth when the All-Father needed Loki's cleverness to secure his throne. It was a masterstroke of manipulation. By invoking the blood oath, he forced the gods to choose between their disgust for him and the sanctity of their own laws. Odin, trapped by his own ancient words, ordered a seat to be cleared. Loki sat, but he did not eat. Instead, he began the systematic dismantling of the divine ego. He started with Bragi, the god of poetry and eloquence, calling him a coward who hid behind words while others bled. When the goddess Idun tried to intervene, Loki turned his gaze on her, exposing the fragility of her virtue and the hunger behind her quiet eyes. One by one he moved around the table, a prosecutor in a room full of defendants who thought they were judges. He mocked Gefjun for selling her soul for a piece of jewelry. He looked at Frigg, the queen of the gods, and spoke aloud the names of the men she had taken to her bed while Odin was away wandering the worlds. The room, once filled with the warmth of wine and fellowship, became a frigid chamber of accusations. This wasn't just an argument, it was a forensic audit of the divine soul. Loki was pointing out the fundamental hypocrisy of their existence. They demanded worship for their morality while practicing the very vices they punished in mortals. When Odin tried to exert his authority, Loki laughed. He reminded the All-Father of the years he spent practicing unmanly magic, of the times he had cheated honest men out of their lives, and the injustice he had woven into the laws of the cosmos. He looked at Tyr, the god of justice, and reminded him that he had no right to speak of law since he had lost his hand to a lie. He looked at Freyr and mocked him for selling the sword that was meant to protect the world, all for the sake of a girl who didn't want him. The gods were paralyzed.
Loki was telling the truth, and in their world, the truth was the ultimate weapon of chaos. He was showing them that their hierarchy was built on a foundation of sand, held together only by the agreement to never speak of what they had done. He was breaking the social contract, proving that he was no longer a servant of the order, but the one who would burn it down to show them the ashes. The air only shifted when the thunder began to roll. Thor, who had been absent, finally arrived, his heavy boots shaking the floor of the hall. Unlike the others, Thor did not debate. He did not care about the nuances of the past or the complexity of the blood oath. He brought the only thing Loki couldn't talk his way around, the threat of absolute, overwhelming force. Thor raised his hammer and promised to knock Loki's head from his shoulders if he spoke another word. Loki looked at the god of thunder, then back at the assembly of trembling deities. He had won. He had forced them to abandon their pretenses of wisdom and justice. In the end, they were forced to rely on the same brute strength they claimed to be superior to. As he prepared to leave the hall, Loki gave them one final look of contempt. He had been the jester, the fixer, and the friend, but tonight he had become the enemy. He had held up a mirror to the divine, and they had been so horrified by what they saw that they had no choice but to cast him out forever. The game was no longer about tricks. It was about the end of the world they had built on lies. Loki walked out into the night, leaving the gods to sit in a silence that would never truly be broken again.
The silence Loki left behind wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a heavy, suffocating pressure that settled into the rafters of the great halls. For a long time, the others had treated his malice as a manageable fire, something that could be contained with a clever word or a stern threat. But as the shadows grew longer, it became clear that the spark had finally caught on something it was never meant to touch. While Loki moved through the fringes of the world, his eyes remained fixed on the one thing the others cherished most. If Loki was the darkness that whispered in the corners, Balder was the light that made those corners disappear. He was the most beloved of all, a figure of such radiance and beauty that his very presence seemed to hold the decay of the world at bay. Yet even light casts a shadow, and it was in that shadow that the end began. Balder began to have dreams. They were not the prophetic visions of a god, but the cold, damp nightmares of a mortal. He saw his own death, a gray and formless thing, creeping toward him through the gold-leafed corridors of his home. When word of these dreams reached his mother, Frigg, a desperate panic took hold of her. She could not imagine a world without her son, for his existence was the only thing that kept the harshness of their reality at bird. She set out on a journey that would take her to every corner of existence. She spoke to the fire, the water, and the iron in the earth. She spoke to the stones, the trees, the crawling beasts, and the soaring birds. She extracted a sacred oath from every element and every living thing. They would never harm Balder. When she returned, she believed she had outsmarted fate itself. To celebrate this victory over death, the gods turned Balder's invulnerability into a sport. They gathered in a wide circle, laughing and shouting as they took turns throwing their most lethal weapons at him. Heavy axes thudded against his chest and fell harmlessly to the grass. Sharp spears turned their points away as if in apology. Even the stones of the earth would not bruise his skin. It was a festival of hubris, a celebration of a world where consequences had finally been abolished. But Loki stood on the periphery, watching the laughter with a cold, analytical detachment. He didn't see a miracle, he saw a puzzle. He disguised himself as an elderly woman and found Frigg, weaving her vanity and relief into a trap. He asked if it was true that absolutely everything in the world had sworn the oath. Frigg, unsuspecting, and perhaps a bit too proud of her work, admitted there was one small exception. High on an oak tree west of the great hall grew a tiny sprig of mistletoe. It had seemed too young, too soft, and too insignificant to bother with. She hadn't asked it for an oath because she couldn't imagine it ever posing a threat. Loki didn't need a mountain to kill a god. He only needed a flaw. He went to the oak tree, cut the mistletoe, and sharpened the soft wood into a fine, slender dart. He returned to the circle of gods, where the game was still in full swing. There he saw Hodder, Balder's brother. Hodder was a god of immense strength, but he was blind, standing apart from the joy because he could not see the target. Loki approached him, his voice smooth and helpful, like a friend offering a hand in the dark. He asked Hodder why he wasn't joining the fun, why he wasn't honoring his brother like the rest. Hodder explained that he had nothing to throw and no way of knowing where to aim. Loki placed the mistletoe dart in Hodder's hand. He told him that he would guide his arm, that he would help him pay tribute to Balder's greatness. Hodder, trusting the architect of chaos for the very last time, pulled back his arm. With Loki's hand on his shoulder, the blind god flung the twig. It didn't bounce. It didn't turn away. It pierced Baldur's chest with the ease of a needle through silk. The laughter died instantly. The silence that followed was different from the one Loki had left in the hall nights before. This was the silence of a heart stopping. As Baldur fell, the light of the world seemed to dim, as if the sun itself had been struck. The gods stood frozen, paralyzed by the realization that their golden age was over. They couldn't even take vengeance in that moment, for the ground they stood upon was sacred, and their grief was too heavy to allow for movement. Loki had done more than kill a man. He had broken the logic of their world. With the death of the sun god, the natural order began to unravel. The air grew thin and biting. The warmth that had sustained their gardens evaporated. This was the onset of Fimbulwinter, the winter of all winters. It was a season that would not end with a spring, but would stretch on for years, driven by a wind that carried the scent of the grave. The snow began to fall, covering the blood on the grass, and for the first time the gods knew that the night Loki had walked into was now coming for them all. The cold that followed the gods was not merely the winter of the world, but a focused, relentless pursuit. Loki had fled the high seats of power, knowing that the death of Baldur was a bridge he could never uncross. He retreated to the furthest reaches of the mountains, a place where the air is thin and the silence is heavy enough to crush the spirit. There he built a house with 4 doors, one facing each direction of the compass, so that no matter which way the gods approached, he would see them coming. He lived in a state of hypervigilance, a predator turned prey, watching the horizon for the first glint of gold or the flash of a spear. In those long, solitary hours, he sat by his hearth and let his mind wander through the mechanics of capture. He took pieces of flax and twine, knotting them together into a mesh, inventing the first fishing net. It was a testament to his nature that even while hiding for his life, he was creating something designed to ensnare. When the gods finally appeared as small, dark shapes against the snow, Loki realized his sanctuary was compromised. He threw his invention into the fire, watching the orange flames lick at the patterns of his genius, and fled toward the nearby Franangr waterfall. He knew the water offered a dimension the land did not. As his boots hit the edge of the churning pool, he shifted his shape, his skin turning to silver scales, and his limbs streamlining into the powerful, muscular body of a salmon. He dove into the freezing depths, disappearing into the froth and the roar of the falls, believing that in the chaotic white water, even the eyes of Odin could not find him. The gods entered the empty house and found only the smoldering remains of the flax. Kvasir, the wisest among them, looked at the white ash in the hearth and saw the ghost of the pattern Loki had woven. He recognized the shape of the net and understood its purpose immediately. Loki had inadvertently provided his hunters with the very tool they needed to catch him. They fashioned a net of their own, copying the Trickster's design, and waded into the river. Twice they dragged the net through the water, and twice Loki avoided the mesh, once by sinking deep into a crevice between stones, and once by leaping high over the cork line. But the gods were persistent. They divided their forces, with Thor wading into the middle of the stream, while the others pulled the net from the banks. As the net closed in for the 3rd time, Loki saw only one path of escape, a desperate leap over the trailing edge of the rope. He launched himself from the water, a streak of silver against the gray sky, but Thor was faster. The god of thunder reached out and caught the salmon in mid-air. Loki struggled with the frantic, wet strength of the wild, but Thor's grip was like iron. He squeezed the salmon just above the tail to maintain his hold, and the myths say he squeezed so hard that he permanently tapered the fish's body, giving all salmon the narrow shape they carry today. The chase was over. The architect of chaos was in the hands of those he had spent lifetimes undermining. They did not take him back to the light of Asgard. There was no room for him there anymore.
Instead, they dragged him to a lightless cavern deep beneath the earth, a place where the walls were slick with ancient moisture and the floor was jagged stone. To ensure his punishment was absolute, they brought his 2 sons, Narfi and Vali, into the damp dark. In an act of vengeance that exceeded even Loki's most cruel machinations, the gods transformed Vali into a ravenous, mindless wolf. Before Loki's eyes, the wolf turned on his brother, tearing Narfi apart in a frenzy of fur and blood. The gods then took the cooling intestines of the dead son and used them as cords to bind the father. As they touched the 3 flat, sharp rocks they had placed on the floor, the entrails turned to iron, shackling Loki by his shoulders, his loins, and his knees. To this physical agony, the goddess Skadi added a final, psychological torment. She fastened a venomous serpent to the ceiling of the cave, positioned so that its fangs hung directly over Loki's face. From the snake's mouth, a constant burning venom began to drip, a liquid fire intended to dissolve his features and sear his eyes for all eternity. The gods walked away, their footsteps echoing up the stone tunnel until the silence of the earth reclaimed the chamber. Loki was not entirely abandoned, however. His wife, Sigyn, whose loyalty remained the one thing he could never break or manipulate, chose to stay with him in the dark. She stood by his side, holding a copper bowl above his face to catch the falling poison. For centuries she has remained there, her arms trembling with exhaustion, her eyes fixed on the steady rhythm of the snake's bile. But eventually the bowl reaches its limit. Sigyn must turn away to empty the venom into a stone crevice, and in those few seconds the protection is gone. The poison splashes directly onto Loki's skin. The agony is so sudden and so profound that Loki convulses with a strength that defies his iron bonds. He heaves against the stones, his body twisting in a frantic attempt to escape the burning. In those moments of transition, the world above feels the echo of his torment. The ancient people of the north did not look to the movement of tectonic plates to explain the sudden violent shaking of the ground. They knew that when the mountains groaned and the earth cracked open, it was not a geological process, but the thrashing of a bound god. The earthquake was the physical pulse of Loki's pain, a reminder that the architect of chaos was still there, waiting in the dark, and that one day the bonds of a son's blood would finally snap. And when they do, the sound will be a thunderclap that echoes across every corner of existence. The snap of those iron-cold chains signals the end of a long, agonizing wait, but the collapse of the cosmic order starts long before the metal gives way. It begins with the cooling of the sun. For 3 years the world is gripped by a winter that refuses to yield to spring. This is the Fimbul winter, a relentless, biting frost that seeps into the bones of the earth and the hearts of men.
In this biting dark, the traditional structures of society rot from within. Brothers turn their blades against brothers. Fathers abandon their children. The moral compass of humanity is spinning wildly, losing its magnetism as the world prepares for its final violent contraction. High above, the celestial mechanics begin to fail. The two wolves that have chased the sun and moon since the dawn of time finally find their marks. The sky goes dark, the stars fall like burning cinders into the sea, and the earth begins to heave in a final desperate convulsion. The mountains, those ancient pillars of the world, crumble into dust. Every shackle, every cage, and every bond ever forged by the hands of gods or dwarves is pulverized. This is the moment Loki has anticipated through centuries of darkness and dripping venom. He rises from the stone floor of his cave, the scars on his face glowing with a cold, pale light. He does not emerge as a broken victim, but as a general. He is the architect who has finally been given the permit to demolish the structure he helped build. As he steps out into the freezing wind, he is no longer the jester or the wayward son. He is the personification of the very entropy that the gods have tried so hard to delay. To lead his army, Loki requires a vessel that reflects the grim reality of his mission. On the churning gray waters of the iron-cold sea, a ship appears. It is Naglfar, a craft of nightmares. It is not built from oak or pine, but from the untrimmed fingernails and toenails of the dead. It is a slow-growing monument to human mortality, a physical manifestation of all the things the living forgot to bury or honor. Loki takes the tiller. His crew is a collection of the forgotten and the monstrous, the giants of the frost, the residents of the dark underworld, and his own terrifying children. Behind him, the Midgard serpent rises from the depths, its massive coils displacing entire oceans, while the wolf Fenrir runs with jaws so wide they touch both heaven and earth. Loki steers this fleet toward the plain of Vigrid, a battlefield that stretches 100 miles in every direction. He is not just looking for a fight, he is looking for a conclusion. As the ship grinds against the shore, the horn of the gods sounds. It is a golden, piercing note that calls the inhabitants of the high halls to their final defense. The gods come out in their shining armor, maintaining the illusion of order until the very last second. Among them is Heimdall, the white god, the watchman who has spent an eternity staring into the distance, waiting for this exact arrival. Heimdall and Loki are the ultimate opposites. One represents the unblinking eye of the law, the protector of the gates, and the purity of the status quo. The other is the shifting shadow, the breaker of gates, and the agent of inevitable decay. When they meet on the battlefield, there is no dialogue. There are no clever tricks or riddles left to tell. They are two halves of a cosmic whole, and their survival is mutually exclusive. Their duel is a blur of motion against a backdrop of a burning world. They represent the final struggle between the desire to preserve and the necessity to transform. In the end, they fall together. Heimdall's sword finds its mark just as Loki delivers a fatal blow. They die as they lived, locked in a struggle that defines the boundaries of the universe. But Loki's death is not a defeat. As the giant Surtur flings fire across the branches of the world tree, and the earth sinks back into the boiling sea, the destruction is total. To the casual observer, this is a tragedy, the end of all things. But looking closer at the logic of the architect, it becomes clear that this was the only way forward. The old world had become rigid, bloated with its own history and the arrogance of its rulers. It had become a cage. Loki is the fire that clears the overgrown forest. Without the total annihilation of Ragnarok, there could be no rebirth. The entropy he invited was the essential ingredient for a new cycle. He knew that for a green and beautiful world to rise from the waves, for the sons of the gods to find the golden game pieces of their fathers in the new grass, the old game had to be flipped over and destroyed. He was the catalyst for the ultimate shift. He accepted the role of the villain, the traitor, and the monster because he understood a truth the other gods were too afraid to face, that nothing is permanent, and that the greatest act of creation is often the act of tearing it all down to start again. The architect of chaos did not just destroy the world, he saved it from the stagnation of eternity. As the steam rises from the cooling waters and the first blade of new grass breaks through the ash, the legacy of Loki remains in the very air, a reminder that change is the only law that truly lasts.
That shifting air, heavy with the scent of wet earth and charred wood, marks more than just the end of a mythic cycle. It marks the moment where the story of the Trickster began to change in the minds of those who told it. For centuries, the architect of chaos was understood as a necessary friction, a jagged stone in the shoe of the gods that kept them from walking too blindly into their own arrogance. But as the centuries turned and the old ways of the North met the rising tide of a new faith, the nuances of Loki's character began to fade. The missionaries and scholars who arrived with the cross brought a new way of viewing the world, a binary lens that demanded a clear distinction between the light of the divine and the darkness of the demonic. In this new, rigid landscape, there was no room for a god of the gray areas. The transformation was gradual but absolute. To the medieval mind, a figure who caused the death of a beloved deity like Balder and led the armies of the dead against the heavens could only be one thing. Loki was stripped of his wit, his complexity, and his role as a cosmic problem solver. He was cast instead into the role of the adversary. The image of Loki bound beneath the earth, writhing in agony as venom burned his skin, was reimagined to mirror the fall of Lucifer. He became a Norse shadow of the devil, a source of pure malice whose only goal was the undoing of creation. This Christianized version of the myth turned a catalyst for change into a personification of sin. We stopped seeing the trickster who won the gods their greatest treasures through his cunning, and we began seeing only the father of lies. Yet, to look at Loki only as a villain is to miss the fundamental truth of the human experience that he represents. The original stories don't show a creature of pure evil, but a chaotic neutral agent. He was the outsider who lived within the walls, the one who saw the cracks in the foundation that the other gods chose to ignore. He was the personification of the unpredictable. While Odin sought wisdom through sacrifice and Thor provided the blunt force of order, Loki provided the movement. He was the spark of electricity that occurs when two opposing forces rub together. Without his meddling, the stories of the gods would have been static and silent. It was his interference that forced the Ægir to grow, to adapt, and to confront the consequences of their own broken promises. When we look at the world today, we see that this ancient energy hasn't disappeared, it has simply changed its clothes.
We see the spirit of the trickster in the figures who disrupt our modern structures, the hackers who expose the secrets of the powerful, the comedians who speak truths that no politician dares to utter, and the innovators who destroy entire industries to build something new from the wreckage. This is the Loki that survives within us. It is the part of the human psyche that bristles against the weight of tradition and the stifling comfort of the status quo. It is that persistent, quiet urge to pull on a loose thread just to see the whole garment unravel. This impulse to disrupt is often viewed with fear, much like the later poets feared the trickster. We are taught to value stability, to seek out the predictable, and to build our lives around the promise of safety.
But the legacy of Loki suggests that total stability is its own kind of death. A system that cannot be questioned, challenged, or broken is a system that has stopped living. The chaos he represents is not the enemy of life, it is the very engine of it. We need the disruptor to remind us that our laws are not divine and our structures are not eternal. We need the one who is willing to play the villain if it means the world might finally wake up. As we reflect on the architect of chaos, we find that his story is ultimately our own. We all carry a spark of that fire within us, the desire to question authority, to break the mold, and to redefine the boundaries of what is possible. It is the intellectual curiosity that refuses to take no as an answer, and the creative spirit that only finds its voice when the old rules are tossed aside. To embrace the trickster inside human nature is to acknowledge that we are messy, contradictory, and constantly evolving. It is the realization that we are not just the builders of civilizations, but the ones who must occasionally set them on fire to ensure something better can grow in the clearing. The steam continues to rise from the cooling waters of the world, and the grass grows green over the ruins of what came before. The trickster remains there, not as a monster in the dark, but as the very principle of transformation. He is the reminder that even in our most structured moments, the potential for a total shift is only one clever thought away. Chaos is the heartbeat of existence, and the urge to change is the only law that truly lasts. As the sun sets on the old myths, we are left with the understanding that the architect of chaos never really left us. He is in every question we ask, every boundary we push, and every moment we choose to embrace the beautiful, terrifying uncertainty of being alive. The cycle of the world turns, the masks of the gods change, but the spirit of the one who dares to disrupt stays forever constant, a flickering flame in the wind, refusing to be put out.